There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another episode of Zooming In, which is an occasional series where I engage with bookish social media luminaries the world over to talk about stuff that gets written about in book publications online. And here I am with a real up and coming. No, that's not right. With a really famous luminary. This is James of the Plastic Cover Critic on Twitter and the debut novelist. I should have had your book in my hand that we launched on my channel a few weeks ago, Gibbons. James, welcome back.
Yes, thank you. It's good to be back. It's always fun doing these.
Well, this one just kind of I think I found out about this one because you retweet it?
Yes, why? Because someone else tweeted it, and I read it and thought, "Wow, yeah, this is great." So yes,
And that put it
I
on
think you
my
got in touch
radar.
just after that.
And thought, let's have James back on to talk about it. I suppose you're all wondering out there, what are we talking about? We're talking about an article in the Sydney Review of Books, an Australian literary journal that is only online and is quite fabulous based on this article. And the article is called Paying to Play, and it's by the Australian novelist Laura Elizabeth. James, help me with the pronunciation. Would you say Woollett?
I think Willett, yeah,
Woollett, yeah.
and well, she's from Perth in Australia. I don't know if she's now based in Melbourne, but yes.
And has written maybe four. I think her fourth book maybe has just recently come out, but certainly three. Author of three books. I've heard her name, and she has written about her experience as a novelist and also her experience as a casual part-time bookstore employee, about all the ways in which things get really fuzzy and almost unethically awkward in terms of what expectations about the commercial marketplace get foisted on, have been kind of foisted onto her in those two literary identities. It's fascinating, very controversial, doesn't pull any punches. And James, what did you make of this?
Well, I thought it was fascinating because almost nobody ever writes about the financial side of publishing, particularly outside of the, so and so got $1 million book deal or whatever, people who sort of inhabit another realm from almost every working writer. So when someone's willing to actually talk about what really goes on, I mean, it's fascinating to see. And also because there's an element, I mean, I think she says herself in the article that, she's now 4 books in, so she's established to an extent, but there is a certain element of bridges burning in going public and talking about what goes on behind the scenes. A lot of people, I think, keep quiet because they don't want to make it so that in future they've cut off people who might otherwise publicize their future books or might be able to, help them network or might be able to help them, promote their career in some way. Because, so much is done in terms of, favors owed and things like that, besides the financial side of things, that if you do sort of talk honestly about what goes on behind the scenes, I think you do put yourself at risk of getting into trouble.
And there are some things in here that I'd never heard of, but I'm really looking forward to the comments that people make after watching our discussion about how prevalent this is in their part of the literary world in Canada or the US, because there was some of it that was quite shocking to me. So the two main things that she reveals that were the most shocking to me were, one, as a part-time bookstore employee, she got a text from her boss at the bookstore to say Christmas, I think she said it was Christmas season's coming. Here are the books that we have to sell that we have many, many copies of. You all get an employee discount. Start buying and reading so you can hand sell them. And she found that ethically questionable. So that was the one thing about the book selling part. And then as a writer, she discovered that a podcast in Australia about debut novels, which is called TFT, the first time, that in addition to featuring interviews with established writers, I think pretty much exclusively Australian writers, and doing a bunch of other interesting things on their podcast, they did have a pay to play segment where if you were willing to fork up quite a bit of money, what was it, $300 or $400?
I think it was about 600 Australian to get
Dollars,
10 minutes of airtime.
to get interviewed on the show, and your publisher would pay it or you'd pay it, but you had to pay to get on that part of the podcast, and they were pretty what's the opposite of transparent? It was pretty not really disclosed that this was a paid play, and then that they would solicit submissions or applications or whatever without explaining until they replied to your message, which is what happened to
Yes,
this
and
author.
also the way they would also, it would seem, simultaneously say they needed to make people pay because they were inundated with people wanting to be on there, while simultaneously saying, "Oh, if you want to be on here, get in touch with
Soliciting
us."
for more.
Yeah, exactly. So if you are inundated, maybe don't be going around demanding more people get in touch. But
I find that really shocking. Now, there's things that I can relate to about, for example, on BookTube, people are get they get sponsored or whatever. They publishers sponsor them to promote their products, and there has been some controversies about how fully transparent they were about the fact that this was a paid portion of this
yes,
video or whatever. So no, I can see the issue, but I'd never heard about it on podcasts before.
no, and it's quite, because it seems as though, they would say basically this segment brought to you by, and then they'd name the publisher or name the writer, which I suppose if you're keyed into it does make you think, okay, well, this might be promoted or supported in some way, but it's not transparent enough as a way of doing it, because this is not I'm of an age and a background where it still feels to me that, well, blogs when they existed, podcasts, videos, it's a work of enthusiasm. And I mean, when my blog was active, for example, I would occasionally get requests to run stuff for money on there. Sometimes book related, sometimes absolutely unhinged stuff that you think, why would they approach anyone to do this on a book blog? And so I'm of a generation that still thinks selling out is a bad thing financially. This is an attitude that seems to have gone by the wayside more recently. So I don't know. I may be hopelessly out of step here, but I certainly never accepted anything like that. I mean, I guess the closest I would come to skirting that line would be receiving free review copies of books. And, my usual thing is I'll ask for a review copy of a book with great enthusiasm. I'll read it. It'll be 6 months before the thing is published. I'll then completely forget that by the time it comes around, I'll have completely forgotten anything about it, and I'll fail to review it or do anything about it. And it'll just sort of slip off into the, into the past. So
I thought I was the only one.
Yeah. So the risk of getting, I guess, what's the word, of being compromised is easy to avoid when you're too lazy to actually do anything about compromising yourself. But I don't think getting a free copy of a book and then reviewing it, if you're reviewing it honestly, is an issue. But certainly talking about a book because you're getting cash to do it seems, yeah, just the idea of being a guest on a podcast where they've only read your book because you've chucked money at them. They're not talking about it because they're enthusiastic. I don't know. The whole thing seems so insincere and so fake. Not having listened to the podcast, perhaps they're wonderful actors. I don't know, but they partly justify it.
And to me, that's just a completely different thing than, I have listened to book podcasts where there are ads that are obviously ads for books, or they say this episode is sponsored by, and then you go to an ad. But to actually interview the author and to kind of fudge it so that you don't really realize that this is a paid interview, that the author has paid or the publisher has paid for this interview. No, that to me is beyond the pale.
Exactly. And they're justifying it by saying, well, this $600 covers the cost of the time to read the book and research the book. But don't take money to read books you weren't intending to read. Spend spend the time to talk about books you're enthusiastic about. And if you need to be financially rewarded for that, I don't know. I can see why people want to get paid to do what they love, but it does seem...
Well, and then there's being a bookstore employee where you're being very almost ordered to buy the books so that you can read them and then hand sell them, and that oh my God. So any personal experiences with any of this? You're a newly published debut author, and I'm sure you must have worked for a bookstore.
Definitely, yes. I've definitely worked for a bookstore in the past, and I mean, to bookstore employees, I mean, even in a country with a livable minimum wage like Australia, and I would hope Canada, I'm not 100% sure, would to require bookstore employees to buy anything from stock that they have to read is unconscionable. I mean, books are expensive. People are not paid enough. I mean, people who work in bookshops are almost universally there because they want to read books and they're using their employee discount, but they should be allowed to use that for the books they want as partial compensation for having to work. I mean, working in a bookshop is a quick way to disillusion yourself about the joy of working in a bookshop. So I don't see.
Second only to being a published writer, perhaps.
That's right. But to request your employees to do that. I mean, if you want them to hand sell a book, give them a bloody free copy, or at least have a copy. You know, people floating around in the staff room that people can read. But you don't buy enthusiasm or force people to be enthusiastic about stuff by money changing hands, whether it's you're paying people to read your book or you're forcing people to spend their own money to buy a book so they can sell it to someone else. It's a rotten way of approaching things.
It's really kind of disillusioning, and I'm just really now curious. And I hate the fact that this article has triggered kind of really cynical curiosity. Like, I've listened to a lot of bookish podcasts. Are any of them paying for? Are they being paid to do these interviews or whatever? I hope not, but it's not something I've ever
same.
heard.
I mean, I suspect not, but you don't know. I mean, you don't know what goes on behind the scenes. I mean, it is hard because to run, I mean, you'd know yourself, to do all of the stuff you do, the technical equipment you need, the time you need to put aside into doing it. I mean, it does cost money, but it tarnishes the whole thing. If you can't trust that what you're hearing is genuine enthusiasm for a book, then there's really no point in being done in the first place. It's just another ad disguised as something else.
And she makes, I think, a very nuanced point about the fact that some of the gauziness of this, under which are these awkward, discomforting things about money, it's underlaid over this kind of veneer of we're creating a community, a literary community. You know, you want to do an Instagram post about your colleague's new book because you hope that they will do one about yours. And is that community, or is that where does that community building begin and end, and where does the kind of sleazy capitalist stuff begin? That's
And it is true too, because you see in the response that the podcast hosts give.
Oh, that was the lamest response I've ever read in my life.
Yes, it was feeble. And there's this kind of appeal to the simultaneous, we need money because, you know, it costs money to do this, but simultaneously any failings we make are because we're amateurs. And it's sort of like, well, you can't have it both ways. If you're demanding cash for what you do, then you need to be professional about it. And being professional about it should include being ethical about it. You can't then just say, oh, we made these mistakes, or we didn't talk about it, or we didn't explain that this was, you know, paid for because, you know, we're doing this part-time and we're just a couple of amateurs. And it's like, well, then don't take cash.
Yeah, and I think those lines need to be just kept very clear, and keep them clear for yourself. As a booktuber, I was once approached by a publisher. I had given a favorable review of one of their books that they did provide me with a review copy, and I said that they had in my review that they provided me with a review copy, and I loved the book, and so I gave a very favorable review, very honest review. And then I was approached by that publisher to say that they would like to hire me to promote their books on YouTube. And I didn't come right out and say no, because I was talking to them on Zoom, and they were and I was like, I was really broke, and I'm thinking, how can I fit this in and around what I'm doing? And ultimately, no, absolutely not. I could not be a publicist because I read the next book that the publisher published, and I hated it, couldn't finish it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the insincerity of it. I mean, it's the one thing that certainly the world of book Twitter or whatever that I float around in is that they're part of the joy of it is it's full of people with genuine enthusiasms for often, you know, weird or obscure little stuff that you wouldn't find out about any other way.
Yes.
And that enthusiasm communicates itself, and so you find out about all these great books that enrich your own life. And if that just becomes, as I'm sure chunks of it have, but I don't think the parts that we're in becomes contaminated commercially, then there's just no point. It's, you may as well just be reading whatever's in the New York Times list because it's on the New York Times list because someone's paid for, 5,000 copies to be bought at the right shop to promote some, crappy political career or whatever.
Absolutely. Do you have any experiences or thoughts from your perspective of being a novelist now?
Well, not really in terms of personal experience, because I'm too far down the the chain. I mean, my book there's no publicity budget, there's no marketing budget of any kind. So it's sort of, I mean, if someone asked my publisher to stump up $600, they just laugh in their face. They don't have $600 to stump up. But
yeah, well, I helped organize your book once 4 weeks ago. We should have taken up a collection for that had I known.
Right. And that was something you did for no recompense of any financial kind yourself. The time that you took.
This is the tat for the tit for tat.
Yeah, exactly. But it does, yeah. So it does put me in. I mean, I'm able to say this as someone who's not involved, but I don't know. I mean, I'm in terms of being completely transparent. For example, my book I've earned slightly over $500, and that's not a fortune by any stretch of the imagination. So it's not of an amount of money that is going to be anyone's going to be splashing any of that around to promote the book. One paid ad or one podcast would completely wipe out any profits from that. But even books that are rather more financially successful, yeah, I mean, if it's a clear ad that you're taking out, that's one thing. But yes, if it's just, as they say, pay for play, it's just, yeah, it's really sleazy. There's actually, I don't know how available this is, just as on the topic. It was I guess it's a zine that was published by another Australian writer, Anwen Crawford, called Decorum Serves the Rich, which she published earlier this year. And it was one of the first things I'd read that talks about the realities of pay for writers and what that means. For example, she's published a novel, and she's published one of those 33 and a third books where each small book is divided to a single album. And she talks about that, how she got an upfront fee for that book, and for her novel that she's published since, No Document, it's called, she gets royalties, but they're quite small. And it talks about the reality of the tiny amounts of money really that are involved in literary publishing and literary writing. I mean, particularly, I guess, in a country like Australia where there just isn't a population to support. I remember I once years ago interviewed an Australian writer called Robert Drew, and he said, he'd been talking to people, and I think he worked out at the time there were maybe 5 Australian writers who could actually live on their incomes. And there were people like, Colleen McCulloch and, what was his name? Bryce Courtney and people like that. And that was about it, massively successful commercial writers. And everyone else just, had a day job. They were writers, but they were mainly journalists or booksellers or something else. So we're talking about, a tiny piddly pool of money that people are scrabbling at to get, unethical chunks of. It just seems the lack of dignity involved is ridiculous when you look at the amount of money that you're going to get out of it anyway. If you're gonna sell yourself for something more worthwhile than $600. I don't know.
And I think if you can't, out of your own passion as a reader and a podcaster, generate enough content for your podcast that you have to solicit payment to get more content, you got the wrong hobby. Jesus Christ.
The world, there are no shortage of podcasts and whatever. The world doesn't need one more podcast that has to justify itself this way. It's unnecessary. Leave it to the people who are enthusiastic enough to do it properly.
I'm going to do 2 more quick things before we close. The first is, what is going on your t-shirt there?
Oh, it's a man who's made an unfortunate life choice and he no longer fits in his childhood toy car and has to be cut out.
How is this like your life, James?
It's not at all representative of anything. No, sorry.
And I can't have you ever again on my channel without giving you a chance for an elevator pitch for your new debut novel.
Thank you. Well, it's 150 years of an Australian family, in little in short stories, each one of which stands alone, and it goes from the 1890s to the 2040s and ends in disaster and misery and the Sydney Opera House burning down. So you can't go wrong.
Very, very succinct elevator pitch, and I will put a link to the book launch that we had, and
Thank you.
people can get further information. And James, as always, a delight. And now, what did we negotiate? Who I was going to pay you $10 for this, or were you going to pay me $10? I can't remember what we
I think
agreed
you're
to.
going to pay me $10, and then it was all going to completely vanish in international fees, and then yeah,
Banking fees.
Yeah, exactly.
Pay to play. I can't even do that right.
No.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.